In March of 1874, the Arkansas River swallowed 12 towns in a single week. I want you to understand the scale of that before anything else. Not 12 neighborhoods, not 12 settlements, 12 towns, Crawford County, Sebastian County, Franklin County, all of them underwater. The floodplain became a massive inland sea covering over 60 square miles. Rescue boats became the only form of transportation across a landscape that had been farmland and main streets and cotton fields just days before. The death toll was never officially recorded. Parish records and family Bibles, the informal accounting systems of communities that did not trust institutions to remember them accurately, suggest at least 340 people drowned in the first week alone. Homes vanished. Entire streets disappeared under 20 feet of brown churning water, carrying trees and livestock and houses torn from their foundations like driftwood, and then the water just sat there for 2 months. April passed. May arrived. The floodplain remained a vast interior sea, while the people who had survived built temporary settlements on higher ground and waited for something that felt like it was never coming back. When the water finally began receding in early June, it revealed something that had been buried under that Arkansas soil for centuries, a graveyard, not a small burial site, not a scattered collection of remains disrupted by the flood, a graveyard arranged in perfect deliberate rows, stone tablets carved in a language nobody could read, and skeletons, complete, undisturbed, still perfectly aligned in their grave, measuring between 8 and 12 feet in total length. Within 6 months, every official record of the discovery had vanished. Within 3 years, every primary witness was dead. This is what the Arkansas River gave up in 1874. And this is the story of how it was taken away. The town of Van Buren, Arkansas sits on a bend in the Arkansas River that has flooded exactly 17 times since white settlers arrived in 1817 floods in 156 years. That is not a community that panics at rising water. The people who built Van Buren and the towns surrounding it built with flooding in mind as a fundamental design constraint. Raised foundations, second-story emergency exits, flood walls constructed from Arkansas limestone by hands that understood the river was a landlord with irregular collection habits. These were people who knew water, who planned for it, who had incorporated its periodic violence into the architecture of their daily lives across multiple generations. So when the rain started in late February of 1874, nobody was alarmed. This was a spring swell. They had seen spring swells before. They knew what to do and they did it calmly. But by March 4th something was different. The rain did not stop. It did not slow. For 11 straight days, the sky opened and remained open with a persistence that went beyond any seasonal pattern the oldest residents could recall. Rivers that normally ran 3 feet deep were now 15 feet and still rising. Tributaries feeding into the Arkansas became torrents. Streams turned into rivers. Creeks erased roads and kept going. On March 15th the levee broke, not in one place, in 7 places simultaneously along a 12-mile stretch of river. The entire northern settlement of Van Buren went underwater in less than 4 hours. Survivors described watching the flood arrive like an ocean appearing in the middle of Arkansas, a wall of brown churning water moving with a force that peeled buildings off their foundations and carried them downstream intact before breaking them apart against whatever stopped them. People climbed onto rooftops and watched their neighbors get swept away. By March 18th, 12 towns along the Arkansas River were submerged. The death toll accumulated in parish records and family Bibles because there was no official mechanism capable of counting the dead across 60 square miles of water. And then, as if satisfied with what it had done, the river settled in and waited 2 full months. The floodplain became an inland sea. Rescue boats replaced roads. Temporary towns appeared on higher ground. The survivors waited with the particular patience of people who had lived through this kind of thing before and understood that eventually, always eventually, the water went back. It began receding in early June of 1874, and when it did, it took the topsoil with it. It took the first several feet of accumulated earth. It stripped the landscape back to layers that had not seen daylight in a very long time. And that is when Josiah Pemberton walked out to survey what used to be his cotton fields. Josiah Pemberton was a farmer, not an academic, not an adventurer, not a man with any particular reason to fabricate an extraordinary story that would complicate his life considerably. He was 43 years old, a cotton farmer who had worked that stretch of Arkansas River bottom land for over a decade, and on June 9th of 1874, he walked out to survey what the flood had left of his property. He was looking for boundary markers, anything that would establish where his land began and ended in a landscape the flood had completely reshaped. The topsoil had been stripped, trees had been uprooted. The gentle contours of a worked cotton field had been replaced by raw exposed substrate that looked like nothing he recognized as his own ground. Instead of a boundary marker, he found a skull. He described it later with the careful precision of a man trying to be accurate about something he knew sounded impossible. Nearly twice the size of his own head, teeth intact, a jawbone thick enough that his first instinct was that it was part of a large animal, a cow perhaps, but the eye sockets were forward-facing. The orbital structure was unmistakably human in its arrangement. Pemberton started digging. Within an hour he had uncovered a complete skeleton. The femur alone measured over 3 feet in length. A normal adult male femur runs 17 to 19 inches. What he was looking at belonged to something that, if proportioned like a human being, would have stood somewhere between 8 and 12 feet tall. He called for help. By that afternoon 7 men were at the site, and what they found in the hours that followed is documented in 3 separate journals, 2 letters, and 1 county land record that survived intact through everything that came after. The graveyard extended in every direction from the first skeleton, arranged in deliberate rows running east to west with the geometric precision of an intentional burial practice rather than the organic scatter of a mass casualty event. The skeletons were buried at a uniform depth of 6 feet. Each grave was marked with a stone tablet approximately 2 feet tall, made of a dark gray stone that the county surveyor present at the site confirmed was not native to Arkansas geology. The tablets were carved, not with pictographs, not with the visual imagery of the burial traditions the men at that site would have associated with indigenous practice in the region, with characters, with what appeared to be a written language, letters, symbols, a script that repeated with the internal consistency of actual writing rather than decorative marking. Nobody present could read it. The local minister could not identify it. The town doctor could not identify it. The county surveyor could not identify it. Some of the symbols bore a resemblance to ancient Hebrew script. Others suggested Phoenician or early Greek, but none of it matched anything any of them had encountered in education or experience. Skeletons themselves were human and bipedal in their fundamental construction, but the proportions were wrong in ways that accumulated into something deeply unsettling. The skulls were elongated beyond any normal variation. The rib cages were barrel-shaped, far wider and deeper than a normal human torso. The arm bones suggested a wingspan approaching 9 feet, and every single skeleton in the portion of the site that had been exposed measured between 8 and 12 feet in total length. And here is the detail that matters most for understanding what they were actually looking at. The bones were not scattered. They were not disrupted by the flood in any way. They were still perfectly aligned in their grave, which means these burials had not been 6 feet deep. They had been far deeper. The flood had stripped away the topsoil and the first several feet of earth, exposing what had been buried perhaps 20, perhaps 30 feet underground. The level of soil compression above the graveyard, noted by the county surveyor in his written account, suggested these remains had been in place for centuries, possibly for over 1,000 years. By June 12th, word had spread beyond Van Buren. People were arriving from neighboring counties, some out of genuine curiosity, others with shovels, hoping to find artifacts valuable enough to sell. The site was becoming chaotic. Josiah Pemberton, watching the discovery he had made begin to dissolve into disorder, sent a telegram to the Arkansas Gazette in Little Rock. The newspaper dispatched a reporter named Clement Hargrove. This detail matters considerably. Hargrove was not a sensationalist writer chasing circulation with outrageous claims. He was a trained journalist with a background in civil engineering, a man whose professional habits of mind were oriented toward measurement, documentation, and the verification of accounts against physical evidence. He arrived at the site on June 15th and spent 3 days there. His methodology was precise. He measured the skeletons independently. He examined the stone tablets and made detailed sketches of the symbols carved into them. He interviewed all 12 primary witnesses separately, comparing their accounts against each other for consistency before incorporating any of their testimony into his reporting. The accounts matched, every single one of them. 12 independent witnesses, interviewed separately, corroborating the same specific details: giant skeletons, stone markers in a non-native material, an unrecognized written language, burial depths suggesting extreme antiquity. Hargrove's reports were published in the Arkansas Gazette on June 19th, June 21st, and June 23rd of 1874. 3 detailed articles documenting one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries in American history, published in a mainstream regional newspaper by a credentialed journalist who had applied professional standards of verification to every claim he made. Those 3 editions of the Arkansas Gazette still exist in the Library of Congress archives. The articles about the graveyard discovery do not. The pages have been removed from the physical newspapers, clean cuts, not torn out in haste, carefully removed, leaving neat edges where the stories used to be, not the entire newspapers, just those specific articles from those specific dates, from those specific editions. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for and knew exactly how to find it. On June 20th of 1874, one day after the first Hargrove article appeared in the Arkansas Gazette, a representative from the Smithsonian Institution arrived at the Van Buren site. His name was Dr. Nathaniel Whitmore. He is listed in the Smithsonian's 1874 Personnel Directory as a field anthropologist. His arrival was prompt in a way that suggests the institution had been monitoring the situation and moved quickly once the story became public. Whitmore examined the site for 2 days. He took measurements. He used wet plate collodion photography, the standard photographic method of the period, to document several of the skeletons in situ. He carefully selected and removed 3 complete skeletons along with 5 of the stone tablets. He arranged for everything to be crated and prepared for transport. And then he made promises. He told Josiah Pemberton that the findings would be analyzed, catalogued, and publicly reported. He told the assembled witnesses that the Smithsonian would send a full excavation team to properly document and preserve the rest of the site. He assured the local community that this discovery would receive the serious scientific attention it deserved. The crates were loaded onto a barge, transporting down the Arkansas River to the Mississippi, and eventually shipped to Washington. There is no record of those skeletons in the Smithsonian's archives. No photographs, no analysis reports, no accession records, no mention of Dr. Nathaniel Whitmore conducting any fieldwork in Arkansas in 1874. The 1874 Personnel Directory lists him. Everything after that date does not. His name appears in no subsequent Smithsonian records of any kind, no published papers, no field reports, no correspondence, no retirement record, no death record within the institution. It is as if he completed his mission and ceased to exist within the institutional record simultaneously. When the Smithsonian was directly questioned about the Arkansas discovery in 1932, 58 years after the event, the official response was that no such remains had ever been received. Dr. Nathaniel Whitmore's name, they stated, did not appear in their personnel records. The 1874 directory that lists him still exists. Their denial of it does not change what the directory says. By August of 1874, just 2 months after the discovery, the site had been purchased. A company called Riverbend Agricultural Holdings acquired the land for an undisclosed sum. The sale was recorded in Crawford County land records, but the actual deed transferring ownership has been lost from those same records. The purchase is documented. The terms, and the identity of the buyers behind the company name are not. Riverbend Agricultural Holdings does not exist in any other context. No business filings in Arkansas or any other state. No tax records. No other land transactions. No correspondence. No employees. No officers of record who can be identified and traced. A company that appeared in the summer of 1874 for the sole purpose of acquiring this specific piece of land and then vanished from every documentary record as completely as if it had never been incorporated. Within 3 weeks of the purchase, construction crews arrived. They did not build on the land. They did not develop it agriculturally as the company name implied. They poured concrete, not soil fill, not gravel, concrete covering the entire area of the graveyard site with a foundation slab designed to seal what was beneath it permanently and irreversibly. Then they built 3 warehouses on top. Those warehouses are still standing today. The property has changed ownership 6 times across 150 years of commercial use. The current owner is a logistics company that has refused every request to allow archaeological survey of the site. Ground-penetrating radar analysis conducted in 2003 by independent researchers working from historical accounts of the site's dimensions and location identified anomalies beneath the warehouse foundations. Rectangular shapes. Uniform depth, consistent spacing. The exact dimensions and arrangement described in the 1874 accounts. Something is still down there, sealed under decades of concrete and commercial construction and legal barriers and corporate ownership. The graveyard that the Arkansas River exposed in June of 1874 was reburied, this time in a material considerably more permanent than the soil the flood had stripped away. Josiah Pemberton died in his sleep in April of 1875. He was 34 years old. He had no documented prior health conditions. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. Clement Hargrove, the journalist who had spent 3 days at the site, who had interviewed all 12 witnesses, who had published 3 detailed articles in the Arkansas Gazette, drowned in the Arkansas River in October of 1875. His body was found 3 miles downstream from Van Buren. He was wearing a full suit. There were no signs of struggle on his body or his clothing. The county coroner ruled it accidental. 2 members of the original excavation crew died in a barn fire in January of 1876. 3 more died from cholera in the summer of 1876. There was no cholera outbreak in Crawford County in 1876. No other residents of the county contracted cholera that summer. 3 men who had been present at the graveyard site died of a disease that was not affecting anyone else in the community they lived in. The remaining 5 primary witnesses died between late 1876 and early 1877. Pneumonia, fever, infections, the ordinary causes that carry people away in any era, distributed across a small group of men in a tight 18-month window. 12 witnesses to the 1874 Van Buren graveyard discovery. All of them dead within 3 years of making that discovery. The statistical probability of 12 individuals in a general population dying within a 3-year window from unrelated natural causes is less than 0.4%. These were not old men. They were not a population with elevated health risk factors beyond the general conditions of rural Arkansas in the 1870s. They were farmers, journalists, surveyors, workers, men in the working prime of their lives who had been in the wrong field on the wrong June afternoon and had seen something that the subsequent 3 years suggested they were never meant to live to discuss. By the 1880s, there were no living primary witnesses to the discovery. By the 1920s, the Arkansas Historical Society had published a formal report declaring that the 1874 finds had been a misidentified Native American burial mound, and that the giant skeletons were simply normal human remains exaggerated in the retelling across generations. No evidence was provided in support of that conclusion. No citations, no physical examination of specimens that no longer existed in any accessible location. Just a declaration published in an official document by an official institution that the event had been misunderstood. The declaration did not engage with the evidence. It replaced it. The stone tablets are the piece of the 1874 discovery that is hardest to explain away, because unlike the skeletons, which were collected and disappeared, and unlike the witnesses, who died, and unlike the site itself, which was buried under concrete, the tablets were photographed before they left Arkansas. Clement Hargrove photographed them during his 3 days at the site. He made detailed sketches. His photographs were later reprinted in a 1902 book called Mysteries of the Frontier, written by a folklorist named Samuel Bridger. Bridger's book is extraordinarily rare. Only 14 copies are known to still exist, most in private collections. But in those photographs, the symbols on the stone tablets are clearly visible and clearly documented. What the photographs show has been examined by linguistic researchers with varying conclusions and consistent fascination. The symbols bear structural similarities to Paleo-Hebrew script, the ancient form of the Hebrew writing system that predates the square Hebrew script used today. Some characters show resemblance to Phoenician, the writing system used by the ancient maritime civilization that conducted trade across the Mediterranean, and some researchers argue considerably further. Others suggest partial similarities to ancient Sumerian cuneiform, the oldest known writing system in human history. One researcher who studied the Hargrove photographs argued that the symbols might represent a proto-language, a writing system that predates all currently known scripts and may represent an earlier stage of symbolic communication from which later writing systems independently derived. Another interpretation points to the tablets as evidence of pre-Columbian contact between Old World civilizations and North America, physical proof that people from the ancient Mediterranean or Middle Eastern world reached the American continent long before any voyage that official history acknowledges. The tablets themselves were made of a dark gray stone that the county surveyor confirmed in his written account was not native to Arkansas geology. Someone transporting that material to this site. Someone carved it with a system of symbols that shows internal linguistic consistency, meaning these were not random decorative marks, but actual writing, an actual communicative system created by people who knew what they were doing with written language. 5 of those tablets were taken by Dr. Whitmore in June of 1874. They arrived in Washington with the crated skeletons. They have not been seen since. The Arkansas River has flooded Van Buren 17 times since 1818. It will flood again. The river does not negotiate with the communities built along its banks. It does not respect property boundaries or corporate ownership or the carefully maintained silences of historical societies and institutional archives. It rises when it rises. It takes what it takes. And when it recedes, it leaves behind whatever the earth was keeping underneath. In June of 1874, it left behind something that the entire institutional apparatus of American historical management spent the following 3 years making disappear. The witnesses died. The records were removed from the archive. The newspaper pages were cut from their editions with careful, deliberate cuts that left no ragged edges. The site was purchased by a company that existed for no other purpose and then ceased to exist. The ground was sealed under concrete and commercial buildings that have now stood for 150 years on top of what ground-penetrating radar tells us is still there, rectangular shapes at uniform depth, in consistent spacing. Exactly as described in accounts that the official narrative has spent a century dismissing as exaggeration and misidentification. The bones are still there. Whatever language was carved into those dark gray stone tablets, stone that was brought to an Arkansas river bottom from somewhere far away by people who knew how to work it and how to write in it. Whatever that language was saying about whoever was buried in those precise east-to-west rows at depths that put them beyond the reach of ordinary floods, it is still saying it, sealed under concrete. Protected by legal barriers and corporate ownership, and the long-practiced institutional silence that has managed inconvenient evidence in this country since at least the 1870s. Think about what the 1874 discovery represented if it was genuine. A burial site of extraordinary scale, containing individuals of physical proportions that no accepted account of human biological history accommodates. Stone tablets written in a language that shows similarities to the oldest known writing systems in the world, but does not match any of them precisely. A burial practice suggesting astronomical awareness, the consistent east-to-west orientation, and knowledge of soil stabilization sophisticated enough to preserve remains at depth through centuries of river flooding. On a continent that official history insists had no contact with Old World civilizations before Columbus, in a state whose indigenous oral traditions, like the Ojibwe traditions in Minnesota, like every indigenous oral tradition that describes prior inhabitants of unusual stature, have been categorized as mythology rather than history, because acknowledging them as history requires acknowledging everything that comes with them. The Arkansas Historical Society declared in 1923 that the discovery had been misunderstood. They provided no evidence, they examined no specimens, they cited no independent analysis. They simply declared it in an official document and moved on. That is not science, that is not history, that is the management of a narrative that cannot survive contact with what the Arkansas River exposed in the summer of 1874. A narrative that required the death of 12 witnesses, the surgical removal of newspaper articles from Library of Congress archives, the creation and dissolution of a shell company, and the permanent burial of an ancient graveyard under industrial concrete to keep it from asking questions that the framework of American historical understanding is not built to answer. The river will rise again. It always rises again. The spring rains come across the watershed and the tributaries swell, and the Arkansas River climbs its banks with the patient certainty of something that has been doing this for longer than any human institution has existed to manage what it reveals. And when the water finally recedes, when it strips back the accumulated earth and exposes the layers that have been sealed away, the only question that will matter is whether we are ready to look at what comes out. Without calling someone to come and take it away. Without cutting it from the newspaper and sealing it under concrete and declaring it misunderstood in documents that provide no evidence, because no evidence is needed when the institution making the declaration has enough authority to make the declaration stick. The river gave up its secret in 1874. The machine buried it again. But the bones are still there. The stone tablets are somewhere in the institutional silence that swallowed them 150 years ago. The shape of what happened is preserved in the fragments that survived 3 journal entries, 2 letters, 1 county land record. A rare book with photographs of symbols carved in a language nobody has been permitted to properly study, and a ground-penetrating radar survey from 2003 that found exactly what the 1874 accounts said was there. That is enough. That is more than enough. The river remembers, even when we are not allowed to.